After the daughter's funeral, the two sons split her millions and kicked the mother to the curb. But she came back, tougher than they could have imagined. Subscribe, write in the comments what city you're from, and would you forgive them? The sky over Millbridge was an unbroken sheet of dull gray the morning they buried Emma Gray, a colorless canopy that matched the mood of the quiet crowd gathered at St. Anselm Cemetery. The air smelled faintly of damp earth in late September, and the trees, already touched with orange and fading gold, shuddered as the wind passed gently through them. A modest gathering of mourners stood by the open grave, their heads bowed, their hands wrapped around paper programs bearing Emma's photo, her birth and death dates too close together for anyone's comfort. The woman they'd come to say goodbye to had died suddenly, and far too young, from a heart attack that even her doctors admitted had left them stunned. Olivia Gray stood beside the coffin in a charcoal coat that had once belonged to her late husband. She was 72 years old, thin as a stalk of winter wheat, and still possessed the quiet dignity that had carried her through decades of motherhood, widowhood, and now this, burying her eldest child. Her gloved hands clutched a linen handkerchief folded and unfolded countless times, not to catch tears but to occupy her fingers. She hadn't cried, not yet. She couldn't seem to find the part of herself that was capable of crying anymore. Her sons flanked her like a pair of shadows. Chris, the elder of the two, wore a finely tailored navy suit and a perpetual expression of detached obligation. He kept glancing at his watch as if the burial were an appointment to be endured. Andrew, younger by 4 years, shifted on his feet constantly, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the crowd. Neither son touched her. Neither offered an arm or word of comfort. The priest, a man Emma had never much cared for, spoke in soothing platitudes about peace, reward, and the mysteries of God's timing. Olivia listened without absorbing a word. The wind tugged at the hem of her coat and carried the smell of chrysanthemums from the flower arrangements surrounding the grave. When it was over and the coffin was lowered into the ground, Olivia dropped a handful of soil into the dark pit and whispered her daughter's name like a prayer. At the reception afterward, held in the function room of the Millbridge Public Library, ironically one of Emma's largest personal donations, people approached Olivia with condolences and memories. They praised Emma's tenacity, her brilliance, her generosity. They spoke of her chain of bookstores that had begun right here in Millbridge with a single renovated storefront, and had since expanded into a regional brand known for championing diverse authors and community literacy programs. No one mentioned Chris or Andrew. They stood near the refreshments table, fielding polite nods but few real conversations. Olivia watched them from across the room, noting the way they spoke in hushed tones, their heads bowed together in conference. Later that night, after the guests had departed and the caterers had packed away the remaining sandwiches and sweets, Olivia sat alone in the front room of Emma's house. The space was immaculate, modern, tastefully decorated in Emma's signature minimalist style, muted tones, sharp lines, art books on every surface. Olivia had never felt entirely comfortable here. Though Emma had always made room for her, still there was warmth in the space, if not in its design, then in the memories. Olivia could almost hear Emma's laughter echoing down the hall, see her balancing 2 mugs of tea and a stack of spreadsheets on a Sunday afternoon. The boys had offered to stay with her, though the offer lacked enthusiasm. Andrew had taken to Emma's wine cellar, emerging only occasionally, while Chris made phone calls in the study. When he finally rejoined her in the front room, he wore an expression of rehearsed solemnity. "We've been thinking," he began, as though he spoke on behalf of some unseen committee. Olivia turned to him slowly, noting the tightness in his jaw, the way he stood as if he were giving a presentation rather than speaking to his mother. "It might be best if you took a break from all this. From the house. From the stress." Olivia said nothing. She merely looked at him. Her silence invited elaboration. "There's a place we've heard about, a retreat. It's quiet, peaceful, just a few hours out of town. We could drive you there tomorrow, give you time to rest." Andrew nodded in agreement from the doorway, glass in hand. "You've been through a lot, Mom. We just want what's best for you." What was best for her, Olivia thought, had been buried that morning. Emma had been her first child, the one who held her hand during Olivia's own widowhood, the one who called every day without fail, the one who understood how to carry a family without breaking apart. Her sons had long since drifted into lives filled with ambition and entitlement, their visits brief and increasingly transactional. She declined politely. She needed rest, she said. Tomorrow they could talk. But as she climbed the stairs to Emma's guest room, unease crawled through her like a slow-moving current. There had been something unnatural in Chris's smile, something brittle in Andrew's eyes. The following morning dawned with muted sun, the kind that barely pushed through the fog, and Olivia found her suitcase packed and waiting by the door. Chris explained that he and Andrew had arranged everything, that she wouldn't need to worry about logistics or planning, that she should trust them. She didn't argue. She'd long ago learned the power of appearing compliant. They drove her out of town in Andrew's black SUV, past the rows of bookstores Emma had helped open, past the community garden she'd funded, past the shelters where she had quietly donated thousands. Chris talked about the weather. Andrew fiddled with the radio. Olivia watched the landscape change from suburban to rural, her eyes tracing the outlines of fields and barns and forgotten roadside stands. When they turned onto a dirt road, Olivia knew. No signs, no buildings, just an expanse of tall grass and the sound of insects. Chris stopped the car and opened the back door. "You can wait here for a bit," he said, too casually. "We'll come back soon." They handed her the suitcase, her handbag, a bottle of water. She stepped out. The door shut behind her. The engine roared. The car disappeared down the road, the sound of tires crunching gravel fading into silence. She stood there for a long time, the wind tugging at her coat, the suitcase handle clutched in her hand. A bird cried overhead. Olivia turned slowly in place, taking in the emptiness, the finality. Her sons had left her. Not in metaphor, not in emotion, but in flesh and action. They had abandoned her. She looked down at her suitcase, then at the road ahead. Her back straightened, her breath steadied. Her heart, though heavy with grief and betrayal, remained intact. She began to walk. She walked for hours, the sun climbing higher, the weight of the suitcase digging into her fingers. Her shoes, chosen for their modest comfort, were ill-suited for long distances, and blisters formed quickly. Still, she walked. Through fields, past rusted fences, down winding roads that eventually led to signs of life. A gas station, a roadside diner, a payphone. Inside the diner, the waitress recognized her. "You're Emma Gray's mother," she said, eyes wide. "I'm so sorry for your loss." Olivia nodded. She accepted a glass of water. She used the payphone. She called a name she hadn't spoken in years, a lawyer who had once helped Emma draft her will. By the time dusk settled, Olivia had found refuge in a modest inn owned by a retired librarian who had once served on the board of Emma's first store. The woman gave her a room without asking for money. That night, Olivia sat on the edge of a strange bed, her hands in her lap, the suitcase unopened at her feet. The betrayal had not yet settled fully, but the shape of her next steps had begun to form. She would not vanish. She would not be erased. She would remember. She would fight. And Emma's name would not be spoken as a footnote in a fraudulent inheritance, but as a legacy built in truth. The morning would bring plans, but tonight Olivia slept, and for the first time in days, her dreams were her own. When Olivia woke, sunlight filtered through the gauzy curtains of the small inn, casting a pale golden glow on the modest room. The air smelled faintly of lavender, and for a moment she forgot where she was. Her eyes settled on the unfamiliar wallpaper, floral with curling ivy tendrils, and the worn wooden dresser with a missing drawer handle. Then the memory returned with a crushing weight. The car, the road, the silence, her sons. She sat up slowly, joints stiff from the long walk, and reached for the pitcher of water the innkeeper had left by the bedside. Her hands trembled as she poured, but she didn't spill a drop. Precision, even now, comforted her. The woman who had taken her in, Margaret Boyle, was waiting in the narrow hallway when Olivia emerged. She was short and round, with a crown of tightly coiled gray hair and warm, intelligent eyes that scanned Olivia not with pity, but with curiosity and concern. Over breakfast, oatmeal, toast with homemade jam, and weak but hot coffee, Olivia offered a version of the truth. She said that her daughter had passed, that she had been left behind on the road by family in a moment of confusion. Margaret didn't pry. She merely nodded, then handed over a card with a local taxi number and a recommendation for someone she trusted, a retired notary who knew things and might help her sort whatever needed sorting. That morning, Olivia walked slowly to the main street of the village, her suitcase trailing behind her with a rhythmic, unhurried squeak. The village was small, little more than a post office, a general store, a diner, and a few scattered houses. Still, it felt more alive than the modern sterility of Emma's house, or the cold, curated perfection of her sons' distant lives. Here, people waved. They paused to speak. They looked her in the eye. She found the diner again, the one where she had called Emma's lawyer the night before. A young man behind the counter remembered her and poured her a fresh cup of coffee before she asked. She sat near the window and opened the small notebook she kept in her handbag, the one Emma had given her the Christmas after Olivia's husband died. It was covered in navy blue cloth with gold-edged pages and a silk ribbon for marking her place. She uncapped a pen and began writing. Not a diary, not a letter, but a record. Dates, events, conversations, who said what and when. She wrote everything she could remember from the day of the funeral until the moment her sons left her on that gravel shoulder. Then she added memories from further back, snippets of conversations with Emma, details of legal documents mentioned in passing, fragments that might seem unimportant to others but that her instincts told her could be critical. By midday, she called a cab and asked to be taken to the nearest town with a law office. Millhaven was 20 miles away, a quiet community with red brick buildings and a courthouse that dated back to the 19th century. The lawyer's office was just off the square, a 2-story converted house with ivy growing up the porch rails and a faded sign that read Cole and Myers, Attorneys at Law. Inside, the receptionist, a thin, tired-looking woman in her 60s, asked her to wait. When her turn came, Olivia found herself seated across from Richard Cole, a man in his 70s with kind eyes and a rumpled suit. He had known Emma, he said, though only peripherally, through town meetings and community grants. He listened as Olivia laid out the facts: the unexpected death, the son's sudden interest in Emma's estate, the disappearance of the original will, and most of all, the forged narrative that cast her as unfit, incapable, needing to be put away. Richard did not interrupt. He took notes, nodded often, and asked clarifying questions. When Olivia finished, he leaned back in his chair and tented his fingers. "There's a process for this," he said at last, "and it starts with locating the last legitimate will and verifying the chain of custody. If your daughter truly transferred control of her business and holdings to you, there should be a paper trail." Olivia reached into her handbag and produced the folder she had guarded since Emma's death. Inside were photocopies of the latest business registration documents, emails Emma had forwarded her about the succession plan, and a handwritten letter in Emma's distinct, looping scrawl referencing the transfer of power. Richard's expression changed as he examined the papers. There was something steely now behind his eyes. "This will help," he said, "but we need to find the original documents and prove they were altered, hidden, or destroyed. If your sons forged new documents, that's fraud. If they used your grief and their access to manipulate the estate, that's elder abuse and theft." The word theft landed with an unexpected weight. Olivia had always associated theft with physical things, jewelry, money, perhaps even a car. But this was more than theft. It was the stripping of dignity, the erasure of decades, the silencing of a voice. Her voice. She left the law office with a plan and a purpose. Richard promised to begin inquiries immediately, to contact the county recorder's office and request any changes to Emma's estate filings. He would file a temporary injunction to freeze the estate from any further movement and would connect with Emma's corporate counsel to confirm Olivia's standing. Back in her room at the inn, Olivia reviewed her notebook again. She had written for hours that afternoon, trying to recall every small detail that might serve her cause. She remembered a conversation with Emma just 2 weeks before her death. They had been sitting in Emma's kitchen, drinking chamomile tea. Emma had mentioned updating the beneficiary information on her accounts, saying something about making it all clean and easy in case anything ever happened. Olivia had nodded at the time, not realizing how urgent those words would become. She called the credit union where Emma held her personal accounts. The young man on the line was polite but firm. Without the proper legal status, he couldn't disclose information. Olivia hung up and wrote down his name, the time of the call, and the exact words he'd used. Every encounter was a piece of the puzzle. The following morning, she returned to Millhaven and began visiting every place she thought might hold a piece of Emma's legacy. Banks, the county office, the business licensing bureau, even the realtor's office that had helped Emma buy the property for her flagship store. At each location, she requested records, asked questions, and made notes. Some doors remained closed, but others creaked open just enough to let light in. An older clerk at the courthouse remembered Emma fondly and promised to pull all recorded documents related to her estate. A bank manager quietly confirmed that a large withdrawal had been made from Emma's trust account 2 days after her death, authorized by Andrew Gray. That night, Olivia sat by the window of her room, watching the stars appear above the quiet village. The sky was clearer than it had been in weeks, and the stars were sharp, cold pinpricks against the dark. Her legs ached. Her back protested every movement, but her mind felt clearer than it had in months. She had not allowed herself to mourn yet. There was no time. Grief would have to wait. First came truth, then justice. She wrote a letter to herself that night, not as a keepsake, but as a contract. In it, she promised to see this through, not just for her own sake, but for Emma's memory, for the life her daughter had built, and the values she had instilled in every corner of her business, her friendships, her generosity. Olivia would not allow Emma's name to be reduced to a footnote in a forged document. She would not allow her sons to erase the woman who had rebuilt their family after their father's death, who had stood by them even when they failed her again and again. She folded the letter and tucked it into the front of her notebook. Tomorrow she would return to Richard's office. They would begin preparing the formal legal challenge. She would begin drafting her own statement, and she would reach out to the one person she had not yet contacted, Claire DeWitt, Emma's longtime assistant and friend, who had vanished from the public eye since the funeral. Olivia suspected Claire knew more than she had let on. She had been unusually quiet, even distant, but she had been loyal to Emma to the end, and if anyone had saved documents, voicemails, emails, it would be Claire. With this new goal in mind, Olivia lay down and turned off the light. The darkness didn't scare her anymore. It was not empty. It was full of her resolve. Her steps had begun, slow but steady, and though the road ahead promised to be long, winding, and littered with obstacles, she would not stop until she stood in the light again, with her name, her daughter's name, and the truth restored. The morning light poured across the table in Richard Cole's office, illuminating a thin halo around Olivia's notebook, which lay open and heavy with ink. Her handwriting had grown tighter in recent days, her thoughts more focused, her recollections sharper. Across from her, Richard flipped through the folder she had given him, his brow furrowing more deeply with each page. The phone on his desk blinked with missed calls, and a stack of legal documents was growing beside him, evidence of how quickly the current had shifted since Olivia's arrival. What began as a vague suspicion had, in a matter of days, crystallized into a legal quagmire that smelled unmistakably of fraud. Olivia sat upright, her coat folded neatly over her lap, her handbag at her feet. She wore a quiet expression of control, but Richard could see the intensity just beneath it. She was not a woman unraveling from grief. She was a woman coiling her strength into something with shape and direction. He placed a final sheet on top of the stack and looked up. The signature on the transfer form, he said slowly, was notarized 3 days before Emma's death. The notary listed isn't registered in the county, and the office address given doesn't exist. That document's fraudulent, Olivia. She didn't flinch. She had known. It wasn't the confirmation that unsettled her, but the clarity. She was no longer guessing. She was now in possession of a truth that could no longer be softened or spun into a misunderstanding. Her sons had stolen from her. More than that, they had stolen from Emma, her memory, her work, her intention, and they had done it quietly, efficiently, with the calculated precision of men who believe themselves untouchable. She leaned forward. Then we moved forward. Richard nodded, reached for a pen, and began writing. That afternoon was spent collecting and copying every piece of corroborating evidence. Olivia provided physical letters, printed emails, and business registration documents she had stored at home. Richard pulled property filings and financial transactions, tracing the sudden movement of Emma's assets in the week following her death. It was subtle, but the pattern emerged. Emma's holdings had been stripped and redistributed with surgical speed, most of them signed over using Olivia's forged signature, or Andrew's authority, as acting trustee. The trust, of course, had been altered. Richard confirmed it through a contact in the probate court, someone who remembered Emma's original filing and remarked, with suspicion, how different the revised one looked. That evening, Olivia placed a call she had been putting off. Claire DeWitt answered on the second ring. Her voice was hoarse and low, as though she'd been avoiding speech altogether. "Claire, it's Olivia." Silence followed. Then the sound of an exhale. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you. I need your help." Claire's apartment was tucked above a florist shop 2 towns over. Olivia took the bus there the next morning, her coat buttoned tightly and a scarf wrapped high around her neck. The ride took 40 minutes, and she spent most of it staring out the window, watching the countryside unfold in gentle slopes and fields gone to frost. When she arrived, Claire greeted her with red eyes and a cautious embrace. The woman had aged in the few short weeks since the funeral, her shoulders stooped with grief she hadn't allowed herself to express. They sat in the small living room, mugs of tea in hand. Claire listened as Olivia explained what she had discovered. When Olivia finished, Claire stood without a word and disappeared into her bedroom. She returned with a thick envelope. "I didn't know what to do," she said, placing it on the table between them. "Emma gave this to me 3 days before she died. She said, 'If anything happens to me, make sure my mother gets this.' I didn't expect anything to happen so soon." I froze. Inside the envelope were original copies of the will, notarized and signed properly, with Emma's unmistakable handwriting in the margins. There were also letters, one to Olivia, explaining why Emma had chosen to leave everything to her mother and why she had excluded her brothers. Another letter was addressed to Emma's attorney, outlining instructions on executing the trust. The date was 2 weeks before her death. There was no ambiguity, no loophole. Back in Mill Haven, Richard's response was immediate. With the original will in hand, he filed an emergency motion to stay any further disbursement of funds or sale of assets tied to Emma's estate. He included a sworn affidavit from Claire confirming the document's authenticity and chain of custody. Within 24 hours, the court had frozen the estate and opened a formal investigation. News of the injunction spread quickly. Olivia received a call from the manager of one of Emma's stores, who had been puzzled by a recent message from Andrew instructing him to begin the transition to a new ownership structure. The manager, a serious man named Desmond Lang, had been with Emma since the first year. He offered to testify on Olivia's behalf, recalling meetings in which Emma had explicitly stated that Olivia was to inherit the business in full. The pieces began to align. Olivia wasn't just reacting now, she was constructing a case. Richard began drafting the civil suit, naming both Andrew and Chris as defendants, charging them with fraud, theft, and elder abuse. He also filed a motion to have Olivia reinstated as trustee and executor of Emma's estate. That night, Olivia didn't return to the inn. She stayed with Claire, and together they sat on the couch with boxes of Emma's old files, sorting, cataloging, preserving. They found receipts, correspondence, handwritten notes with Emma's plans for expanding her bookstore brand into underrepresented communities. There were lists of scholarship candidates, grant proposals, even a sketched-out outline for a mentorship program, all of it now endangered by her brother's greed. Olivia's mind went back to the funeral, to the way Chris had scanned the crowd instead of grieving, to how Andrew had arrived late, hungover and hollow. They had not wept. They had not held her hand. They had not carried Emma's casket. And now they were tearing apart the legacy she had built with the same casual entitlement they'd once used to ask her for money for tuition, for rent, for bail. The final confirmation came the next morning when Richard's office received documentation from a financial institution showing that Andrew had authorized a wire transfer of over $400,000 from Emma's trust account to a limited liability company registered in Nevada. The company, as it turned out, was owned jointly by Andrew and Chris. The timing of the transfer, 2 days after the funeral, left no room for interpretation. They had waited until the dust settled, until the mourners had gone home, until Olivia was too stunned to fight. Then they had taken what they wanted, only they hadn't counted on her standing back up. Olivia returned to the florist's apartment, sat on the couch, and opened the letter Emma had written to her. The words were simple, elegant, and final. Emma had known something Olivia hadn't. She had known her brothers would try to take what wasn't theirs. She had known her mother would need proof, and she had made sure to leave it behind. Olivia folded the letter carefully, pressed it to her chest, and closed her eyes. She would not let them win. Not now. Not ever. The legacy Emma left was not just money or buildings or a brand. It was integrity, vision, and the strength to do what was right, even when surrounded by betrayal. Olivia had been abandoned, but now she was rising, and soon her sons would learn what it meant to steal from the wrong woman. The morning Olivia stepped back into Richard Cole's office, the atmosphere had changed. The quiet civility of their earlier meetings was replaced with a current of urgency that pulsed beneath the surface of every word. Richard's secretary greeted her with a brisk nod, her phone pressed to one ear, her free hand scribbling names on a legal pad. Inside the office, Richard stood behind his desk, already in the middle of a conversation with someone on speakerphone. He looked up as Olivia entered and gestured for her to sit. She obeyed without speaking, taking her place in the same leather-backed chair where she had first declared her intent to fight. Now, that intent had teeth. The man on the speakerphone was a clerk from the probate court. His voice crackled with the clipped rhythm of someone accustomed to bureaucracy. He confirmed that the court had received Richard's filings, including the original will, the affidavit from Claire DeWitt, and the motion to stay all estate activity. The case had been assigned to a judge with a reputation for severity and a particular distaste for estate fraud. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday. When the call ended, Richard turned to her, his face tired but satisfied. "We have momentum," he said, "and we're going to use it." In the days that followed, Olivia's life became a blur of meetings, calls, and planning sessions. She moved into a modest apartment above the town's historical society building, offered to her by the director, a woman named Hazel who had admired Emma for years. The apartment was small but warm, with sloped ceilings and a window that overlooked the square. Olivia kept her few belongings tidy, her notebook always at hand, its pages multiplying with notes, reflections, and strategies. One of the first things she and Richard agreed upon was the need for public awareness. Olivia was hesitant at first, loath to parade her family's betrayal before strangers, but Richard made a compelling case. "They've already manipulated perception," he said. "They're spinning you as unstable, confused, overwhelmed by grief. You have to counter that, and we'll do it with facts, with your voice." Olivia reached out to Sophia James, a reporter from the regional paper who had once interviewed Emma for a feature on local entrepreneurs. Sophia remembered Emma vividly. Her sharp insight, her wry humor, the way she had spoken about her mother with quiet reverence. When Olivia told her the truth about what had happened since Emma's death, Sophia was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "I want the story, but we do this right. with documents, timelines, corroboration. By the end of the week, Sophia had everything she needed. Olivia handed over a packet of evidence: the notarized will, the forged documents, the bank transfer records, and a detailed timeline of the events leading from Emma's death to Olivia's abandonment. Claire provided a written statement. Richard confirmed legal accuracy. Sophia's editor cleared the story for front-page publication in the Sunday edition. When the paper hit the stands, the effect was immediate. Headlines in bold serif font declared, "Widow battles sons over daughter's legacy. Fraud allegations rock Gray estate." Underneath, Olivia's photo appeared beside one of Emma, taken just months before her death. The article was thorough, compassionate, and damning. It laid out the facts with precision, painting a portrait not only of betrayal, but of resilience. Olivia's name spread through town, across counties, and into digital networks. Messages began to pour in: letters, emails, voicemails, women who had known Emma, customers from her stores, strangers who had read the story and wanted to offer support. But the backlash arrived just as quickly. Chris and Andrew issued a statement through their lawyer, calling the accusations hurtful and unfounded, describing Olivia as a grieving and confused elderly woman who had been misled by opportunists. They denied any wrongdoing, claimed the documents they had submitted were valid, and warned of potential legal consequences for defamation. The insult was strategic. Olivia recognized the language. They were attempting to delegitimize her by targeting the one thing society always questioned in women her age: clarity of mind. But they had made a miscalculation. Olivia was not confused. She was not feeble. She was, for the first time in decades, awake. Richard contacted Desmond Lang, the manager of Emma's original bookstore location. Desmond had stayed on after Emma's passing, uneasy about the sudden changes Andrew had tried to implement. Olivia met with him in the back of the store, in the same room where Emma had once held community readings and planning meetings. Desmond offered more than just moral support. He brought printouts of internal memos, emails Andrew had sent under the pretense of restructuring. One email instructed Desmond to fire 2 employees who had been with the store for years. Another authorized the closure of the children's reading program, citing low return on investment. Olivia took the documents in hand, her face unreadable. She would never have allowed this, she said, and Desmond nodded, his jaw set. The lawsuit expanded. Olivia's legal team now included a younger attorney named Lacey Burnham, brought on by Richard to assist with the increasing load. Lacey was sharp, driven, and outraged on Olivia's behalf. Together, they filed motions to reverse the transfers of Emma's assets, to recover the stolen funds, and to challenge the standing of the trust revision submitted by Andrew. Then came the email that changed everything. It was sent anonymously through an encrypted service to Richard's office. The subject line read, "You're looking in the right place." The message included attachments, scanned documents, bank records, and a spreadsheet tracking financial transactions between Chris and Andrew's LLC and a series of shell companies. One of the accounts was tied to a luxury development project in upstate New York. Another was linked to a hedge fund under federal investigation. Richard brought the information to Olivia the same evening. She sat on the floor of her apartment, the documents spread around her like a paper snowdrift, her reading glasses perched low on her nose. "They used her estate to launder money," she said quietly. Richard nodded. "And they likely aren't the only ones." It became clear that Emma's death had not only created an opportunity for theft, it had triggered a plan already in motion. Chris and Andrew had been building this scheme for months, perhaps longer, counting on Emma's solitary nature and the trust she had placed in them as family. Her sudden death had accelerated their timeline, but not changed their goal. Olivia made a decision that night. She would not just pursue civil charges. She would bring in the authorities. She would press for criminal charges of fraud, money laundering, and elder abuse. The following day, Lacey contacted the district attorney's office. A meeting was scheduled. Olivia would testify. She would provide her documents, her letters, her memories. She would stand, not as a grieving widow or a frail matriarch, but as the sole guardian of her daughter's legacy. In the days leading to the court hearing, Olivia prepared herself. She practiced her statements. She reviewed every detail. She spoke with Claire, with Desmond, with Sophia. She read and reread Emma's letters. Each sentence was a lifeline, a reminder that Emma had believed in her mother's strength until the very end. The night before the hearing, Olivia stood at the window of her apartment, looking out over the town square. The trees had begun to turn gold and crimson. The air smelled of wood smoke and coming frost. She thought of her children, not just Emma, but Chris and Andrew, once boys with scraped knees and whispered secrets. She thought of how far they had traveled from the children she had raised. The betrayal had cut deep, but the fight that followed had transformed her. She was no longer waiting to be rescued. She was no longer afraid of being alone. She was leading. And by tomorrow afternoon, she would step into that courtroom not as a victim, but as the woman who refused to be buried with her daughter's memory. She would speak, and the truth would echo. The morning of the hearing began not with fear, but with resolve. Olivia rose before the sun, dressed with slow precision, and tied her hair into a neat, low bun that exposed the strong line of her neck. In the mirror above the dresser, she saw a woman who looked older than the one who had buried her daughter 5 weeks ago. Her face was leaner, her mouth drawn tighter, and her eyes harder. She thought of Emma and felt a pulse of something sharp, not grief exactly. Grief had hollowed itself into a quieter, permanent ache, but something closer to purpose. The courtroom would be full. The opposing attorneys would be there. Her sons would be seated across from her, flanked by polished lawyers and buried under layers of denial, but she would be the one speaking. The courtroom was smaller than she had imagined, intimate in a way that forced everyone to acknowledge each other. The ceiling was high and domed with wood panels, and the judge presided from a raised bench with a gaze that flickered across the room like a searchlight. Olivia sat beside Richard and Lacey at the petitioner's table. Across from them, Chris and Andrew looked uncomfortable in their matching suits. Chris stared straight ahead with a tight jaw, but Andrew glanced at her briefly before looking down again. Olivia met his glance without flinching, her expression unreadable. The first part of the hearing proceeded with mechanical clarity. The judge reviewed the timeline, the filings, and the affidavits. Lacey presented the original will, still sealed, notarized, and signed 2 weeks before Emma's death. Claire's statement was submitted. The clerk read aloud the financial transactions that had triggered the investigation, including the wire transfers into the LLC account. The judge paused at those entries, her brow lifting just slightly. Chris's attorney stood and objected, arguing that the trust revisions were legal and that Emma had made them willingly, citing a letter now known to be forged, allegedly in Emma's handwriting. Olivia watched the judge's eyes narrow as Richard submitted handwriting analysis, proving the signature had been traced from an older form. The notary, called to testify, admitted under oath that he had never signed the document and had no knowledge of any meeting with Emma Gray. Then it was Olivia's turn. She rose slowly, approached the witness stand, and placed her hand on the worn Bible as she was sworn in. Her voice was even. Her hands were still. She gave her account with the same precision she had applied to raising her children and later to surviving their betrayal. She described the events following the funeral, the conversations with Chris and Andrew, the ride to nowhere, the gravel shoulder. She told the court how they had left her there without a phone, without explanation, without dignity. She did not weep. She did not dramatize. She laid out her testimony with the restraint of someone who had spent a lifetime being underestimated. When she stepped down, the courtroom was silent. The judge declared the revised trust and estate documents null and void, pending further investigation. A temporary conservatorship was granted to Olivia. The court agreed to freeze all financial activity tied to the estate and to forward the case to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges. It was, in legal terms, a preliminary victory. In human terms, it was the first tangible blow against the web her sons had spun. But victories had consequences. Later that day, outside the courthouse, a cluster of reporters waited. Olivia walked past them without speaking. Chris and Andrew did not. They stopped, flanked by their attorneys, and made a short, venomous statement. Chris accused Olivia of being manipulated. Andrew claimed they had acted only in the estate's best interest. Their faces were tight with desperation and something else, fear. By nightfall, the counterattack had begun. Olivia's phone rang late. It was Richard. "Check the news," he said. On one of the regional stations, a segment aired featuring a man claiming to be a former employee of Emma's. He described her as erratic, overbearing, and mentally unstable. He said she had often changed her mind about business decisions and accused her of favoritism and mismanagement. The piece had clearly been planted. Olivia recognized the man. He had been fired by Desmond 3 years ago for falsifying inventory records. The implication was clear. If Emma had been unstable, then perhaps her estate decisions had been questionable. Perhaps her mother, too, was reacting out of confusion and grief. The attack intensified over the next several days. Anonymous social media accounts began to circulate doctored emails that showed Olivia making inappropriate financial decisions. Fake messages appeared on business forums suggesting that Emma had been on the verge of bankruptcy and that Chris and Andrew had saved her stores. A whisper campaign emerged, describing Olivia as a controlling mother who had manipulated Emma into disinheriting her siblings. It was a familiar pattern. Undermine the character, rewrite the narrative, create enough noise that the truth becomes one voice among many. But Olivia did not retreat. Instead, she went on the offensive. Sophia James published a follow-up article in the Sunday paper titled, "When Legacy is Targeted, the Fight for Emma Gray's Truth." In it, she laid out the coordinated nature of the misinformation campaign and documented how shell companies tied to Chris and Andrew had already begun selling off Emma's business properties before the forged documents were even filed. Sophia had sources, she had records, and she had the kind of reputation that made people read every word she wrote. Olivia and Lacey filed a defamation lawsuit against the man in the interview. Desmond Lang provided a sworn statement about his firing and the reasons behind it. Other former employees came forward, supporting Emma's leadership and testifying to her clarity and purpose in the weeks before her death. One woman, a young assistant manager named Jasmine, It saved a voice message Emma left the day before she died. In it, Emma spoke calmly about her plans for the store, her excitement about a new literacy program, and her gratitude for her staff. The message was time-stamped. Her voice was steady. Even with the firestorm around her, Olivia found moments of calm. She moved about the bookstore in the mornings, the one Emma had opened first, walking the aisles, talking with the staff, making small improvements. She knew she didn't have to manage it herself. Desmond was more than capable, but she needed the tactile connection to something real, something that had not been corrupted. Customers greeted her with warmth and encouragement. Notes arrived in the mail. One came from a girl who had received Emma's scholarship the year before, now studying literature at a state college. She enclosed a copy of her first published poem and wrote that Emma had changed her life. But the war continued. Chris's attorney submitted a new motion challenging the court's conservatorship order. He alleged bias, improper procedure, and undue influence by third-party actors, naming Claire, Desmond, and even Richard. It was a desperate move, transparent in its intent. The court dismissed the motion within days, but Olivia saw the strategy: throw up walls, delay the process, outspend the opponent. What they hadn't anticipated was that Olivia would not break. Her team expanded. Community leaders joined her cause. Donations flowed in to cover legal fees. The district attorney's office moved forward with its own investigation, and a grand jury convened to review the evidence. Chris and Andrew were subpoenaed. One afternoon, Olivia received a visit from a former friend of Emma's, a woman named Marisol, who had once been close with both Andrew and Chris. She came without notice, hat in hand, remorse on her face. She brought with her a flash drive containing email correspondence between Chris and a business partner. The messages confirmed that the LLC had been established solely for funneling money from Emma's trust. The timing, the tone, the specificity, it was damning. Olivia thanked her without ceremony. Her anger had shifted by then from fire to ice. She no longer felt rage. She felt necessity. By the end of the 5th week, the narrative had changed. Olivia was no longer just the grieving mother. She was a plaintiff, a strategist, a force. Her sons were no longer sympathetic figures caught in family grief. They were defendants. And public opinion had begun to turn. At night, she sat alone with her notebook, reviewing what had been accomplished, what remained. She thought of Emma always. She imagined her daughter watching all this unfold, proud, yes, but sad, too. Emma had loved her brothers once. She had believed in them. Olivia remembered the way Emma used to pause before writing checks to help them, how she would sigh but sign anyway. She had wanted to believe that family meant something. Olivia had believed it too, but not anymore. Now, family was a battlefield, and she, the last one standing, would not be the one to fall. Not now. Not when the end was finally in sight. Not with justice so close she could taste it. It was raining the morning the judge delivered the final ruling. The windows of the courthouse were streaked with rivulets of water, and the gray skies above Millhaven hung low and heavy, pressing down on the town like a held breath. Olivia stood beneath the overhang outside the courthouse entrance, waiting for Richard and Lacey to arrive. She wore a navy coat, buttoned to the top, and a pair of low-heeled shoes that had been polished to a dull shine. Her umbrella remained folded in her hand, forgotten. The chill had seeped into her bones, but she didn't feel it. Not really. Not in the way that mattered. When Richard and Lacey emerged from the car, their expressions were solemn, unreadable. They greeted her quietly, then ushered her inside, where the bailiff directed them to the same courtroom that had hosted their previous hearings. Chris and Andrew were already seated with their lawyers, their suits impeccable, their expressions composed. But Olivia saw the fatigue in their faces, the strain in the way Chris adjusted his cufflink 3 times in a row, the way Andrew kept his gaze fixed on the tabletop as if avoiding her eyes would somehow erase everything they had done. The judge entered. The room rose. Olivia remained still for a moment before standing with the others. Her heart beat slowly, steadily, like a metronome she had trained herself to follow. When the judge began to speak, her voice was clear and unhurried. She summarized the facts of the case, outlined the evidence submitted, recounted the testimonies given. Then, in words as definitive as the strike of a gavel, she pronounced the verdict. The court recognized Olivia Gray as the rightful executor of Emma Gray's estate. All transfers made under the forged documents were nullified. The trust revisions were declared fraudulent. Chris and Andrew Gray were stripped of any legal claim to Emma's assets, including her business, properties, intellectual property, and accounts. A criminal investigation, now formally in the hands of the district attorney's office, would proceed independently. The judge's final note was sharp. Any further attempts to interfere with the estate would be met with immediate contempt proceedings. The room remained silent as the words settled into place. Olivia closed her eyes for a brief moment, allowing herself to breathe fully for the first time in weeks. The pressure that had gripped her chest loosened, though it did not disappear entirely. There was no euphoria, no relief, no swelling of pride, only a deep, quiet affirmation that what had needed to be done had been done. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered again. Richard answered questions while Olivia remained by the steps, watching raindrops collect in the cracks of the pavement. She heard fragments of his voice, phrases like "justice served" and "a significant moment for elder protection laws," but they felt distant, like echoes from another life. She had not fought this battle for attention or vindication. She had done it for Emma. And now that the legal war had ended, she felt not triumph, but exhaustion. Chris and Andrew passed by without speaking. They did not look at her. Their shoulders were hunched against the rain, their lawyers flanking them like failed bodyguards. Olivia watched them go, wondering how it had come to this. She remembered birthdays in the old kitchen, the 3 of them crowding around a cake, Emma laughing as she teased Andrew about the frosting on his nose. She remembered Chris as a boy with scraped knees and big questions, always following Emma around, begging to be included in her games. She remembered her own voice scolding, comforting, guiding. None of it had been enough. She returned to her apartment above the Historical Society, changed out of her damp clothes, and sat by the window with a cup of tea gone lukewarm. The town below moved on, unaware that something irreversible had just occurred. People passed by on errands, umbrellas tilted against the wind, voices muffled by hoods and collars. Life continued. And Emma was still gone. Richard called that evening to check on her. She thanked him, told him she was fine, and assured him that she would be at the bookstore in the morning. There was work to be done. Legal closure did not mean the work of restoration was finished. The next day, she arrived at the flagship store before opening. Desmond was already there, unlocking the front door, his arms full of new shipment boxes. Olivia helped him stack them inside, her hands finding old rhythms in the familiar space. The scent of ink and paper wrapped around her like an embrace. The store had always been Emma's sanctuary, her place of purpose. Now it was Olivia's responsibility to carry it forward. The staff greeted her warmly with tentative smiles and quiet support. They were still recovering, too. The weeks of uncertainty had shaken them, and while the verdict had brought clarity, it had also underscored how fragile stability could be. Olivia addressed them in the back room, thanking them for their loyalty, their resilience, their commitment to Emma's vision. She told them the store would remain open, that the programs Emma had cherished would continue, and that any profit from the estate moving forward would be reinvested into the community. She spent the rest of the day in Emma's old office, reviewing the business files, meeting with suppliers, and drafting a plan to reestablish partnerships disrupted by the chaos. She reached out to the managers of the other locations, arranging a virtual meeting to discuss the future. There were budgets to balance, contracts to renew, trust to rebuild. That evening, she returned to her apartment and sat with the letters Emma had written. She read them again, slowly, taking in the weight of every word. In the final letter, Emma had written, "You've always been my anchor, even when I didn't say it. I built all of this on your strength. If I'm not here, I need you to keep it standing." Olivia folded the letter carefully and placed it in a box with other keepsakes. She lit a single candle on the windowsill, not for ceremony but for presence, for the reminder that even in absence, love could still occupy space. The calls began again a few days later. First, it was Andrew. His voice was small, cautious, more boy than man. "I made mistakes," he said. "I was scared. I let Chris push me into things I shouldn't have. But I never meant to hurt you." Olivia listened but said nothing. He spoke for another few minutes before realizing she would not answer. "Can we meet?" he asked. "Just to talk?" She hung up. Then came Chris's email, polished, impersonal, threaded with legalese. He offered a formal apology, requested a reconsideration of the settlement, suggested a private discussion. Olivia did not reply. She forwarded the message to Richard, then deleted it. They had made their choices. They had left her on the side of the road. They had tried to dismantle everything Emma had built and had nearly succeeded. Forgiveness was not a door she had chosen to leave open. Not anymore. 2 weeks after the court ruling, the district attorney announced charges against both brothers: fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. The trial would take months, possibly longer. Olivia did not attend the press briefing. She stayed at the store, stacking books, restocking shelves, talking with customers. One of those customers was a teenage girl named Mariah, who had been one of Emma's scholarship recipients. She came in holding a handwritten thank you note and a copy of her acceptance letter to Columbia. She hugged Olivia and whispered, "She changed my life." That night, Olivia walked home under a clear sky. The stars were brilliant, sharp against the blackness, and for the first time in weeks, she lifted her face to the sky without the weight of fear pressing down. In her apartment, she lit another candle, brewed herself a pot of chamomile tea, and began writing in her notebook again. Not legal notes or timelines, but ideas. Visions for the future. Emma had wanted to open a writing center. Olivia would do it. She imagined workshops for teenagers, classes for single mothers, poetry readings in the store on Saturday nights. She imagined, and for the first time since the funeral, she smiled without pain. She went to bed with the window open and the sound of wind in the trees. And when she slept, she dreamed not of courtrooms or betrayals or old scars, but of a table full of books, a room full of people, and her daughter standing at the center, laughing. The leaves had begun to fall by the time Olivia opened the doors to the Emma Gray Community Foundation. It was a crisp October morning, the kind that carried the scent of cinnamon and dry leaves and hinted at the coming frost. The sun had not yet risen high enough to warm the air, and the town was still shaking off its early quiet when Olivia turned the key in the front door of the restored brick building. Inside, the smell of fresh paint mingled with the faint aroma of old paper and new promise. She had chosen to house the foundation in the upper floor of the flagship bookstore, the one Emma had first opened all those years ago with her own money, her own vision, and her own stubborn belief that stories mattered. The downstairs still operated as it always had, bustling with readers and booksellers and curious tourists. But the upstairs now held something more. 2 rooms had been converted into workshop spaces, one fitted with desks and chalkboards for classes, the other arranged as a cozy reading lounge with soft chairs and lamps shaped like open books. Along the hallway walls, photographs of Emma hung in simple frames, images of her opening stores, giving talks at schools, sitting on panel discussions, laughing with her staff. The foundation had been Olivia's idea, but it had grown from seeds Emma herself had planted. In the final months of her life, Emma had been quietly assembling the framework for a literacy program and grant initiative. She had drafted proposals, made lists of women-owned startups she wanted to support, and identified neighborhoods where the bookstore model could transform abandoned spaces into vibrant community anchors. Olivia had discovered these plans in a box in the back of Emma's closet, beneath a stack of tax documents and fundraising notes. They were detailed, annotated in her daughter's lupin handwriting, and filled with the kind of strategic clarity that came from years of vision refined through lived experience. Now it was real. The foundation offered monthly workshops for aspiring writers, free tutoring for students struggling with reading, and small business grants for women in underrepresented communities. It provided job training, mentorship, and a quiet space to study. Olivia had hired a small staff, women and men who had once worked with Emma, who remembered her not as a boss but as a leader. They carried her memory not like a relic, but like a torch. Olivia herself taught 2 classes a week. One was a writing seminar for women over 50, a space where stories long held in silence could finally be spoken. The other was a leadership and ethics course for teenagers where they discussed not just how to succeed, but how to succeed with integrity. In every session, she invoked Emma's name, not as a martyr, but as a blueprint. Her apartment above the Historical Society remained her home. She had declined offers from well-meaning friends to move somewhere more spacious or modern. She didn't want more space. She wanted fewer distractions. The apartment had become a sanctuary, filled with Emma's books, a few pieces of antique furniture, and a cat she had adopted after finding it curled beneath the bookstore awning one rainy morning. She named him Poe, and he followed her from room to room like a silent chaperone, always watching, never intruding. Life moved forward in slow, steady rhythms. The legal cases against Chris and Andrew progressed. Olivia didn't attend the hearings. Richard and Lacey kept her informed, but she wanted no part of the proceedings beyond what was necessary. She had seen enough of her sons in those courtroom pews, their expressions cold and calculating, their apologies shallow and contingent on consequence. The law would take care of them now. She had nothing more to say to them. Occasionally, Andrew tried to reach out. Letters arrived, some apologetic, some angry, some meandering in their desperation. Olivia read the first few, then stopped. She placed them in a drawer she rarely opened, beside old family photographs that once gave her joy but now lived in shadow. Chris never wrote. He had vanished from the public eye entirely, his legal troubles and the collapse of his firm burying him in a silence Olivia did not care to disturb. The bookstore thrived. Desmond continued to manage operations with quiet excellence. New employees came and went, but the core team remained, bonded not only by their work but by the shared knowledge of what they had survived together. Customers still asked about Emma. Sometimes they told stories. A woman once recounted how Emma had personally driven across town to deliver a rare poetry book to her dying husband. A teenager remembered Emma reading aloud every Saturday morning, changing voices for each character and making the children laugh until they cried. Emma lived in those stories. Olivia listened to them all. One evening, Olivia hosted the Foundation's first harvest dinner in the back garden behind the store. It was a modest affair. Folding tables, white lights strung from poles, dishes cooked by volunteers and donated by local restaurants. Invitations had gone out to friends, staff, scholarship recipients, and neighbors who had stood by her during the storm. People gathered under the lights, their breath visible in the cooling air, their voices warm with laughter and memory. Desmond gave a toast. So did Claire. Then Sophia stood, holding a glass of cider, and spoke about Emma's impact on the town, about Olivia's courage, and about the power of truth to outlive deceit. Olivia did not speak until the very end. She rose, her hands steady, her eyes sweeping across the crowd. "I won't pretend this journey hasn't cost me," she said. "I've lost more than I ever thought I could survive, but what we've built here, what you've helped make real, is not about what was taken. It's about what remains, and what remains is love, service, purpose, and Emma." There were tears, yes, but also laughter, applause, the kind of murmured affirmations that mean more than any speech. After the guests had gone, Olivia remained behind, walking slowly between the empty tables. She looked up at the string lights swaying gently in the breeze. Poe trailed behind her, tail flicking. From somewhere across the yard, Desmond called out a good night. She waved, but didn't speak. She sat on one of the benches, wrapped her coat tighter around herself, and closed her eyes for a long moment. She felt the silence settle around her, not heavy or oppressive, but gentle, peaceful. Emma would have liked this. She would have critiqued the table placements, insisted on better centerpieces, and then sat with a glass of wine and a plate of apple pie, content. Olivia could almost hear her voice in the rustle of leaves above. The next morning, Olivia walked to the edge of town and stood at the cemetery gate. It was not a place she visited often. She didn't need a gravestone to remember, but today she carried a small bouquet of marigolds and rosemary, both grown in her own windowsill planter. She placed them at the base of the marker and knelt briefly, pressing her palm against the cool stone. "I kept my promise," she whispered. No more needed to be said. She rose and walked back toward town, her pace unhurried, her spine straight. The day had just begun, and there were lessons to plan, emails to answer, grant decisions to finalize. There was always more work, but it was good work. It was work with meaning. The Foundation's website now had a photo of Emma on the homepage, smiling beneath the words she had once said in an interview. "Books can't fix everything, but they can remind us who we are and who we could become." Olivia had those words framed and hung them in the entryway, just above the front desk. She saw them every day when she arrived. And every day they reminded her that Emma's story hadn't ended with betrayal or theft or silence. It had ended with legacy, and Olivia had made sure it would endure. Subscribe for more stories like this. Watch the next video if you want to continue, and feel free to share this one with someone who needs to see it.